The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop by Willa Cather, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 10 of Death Comes for the Archbishop. I'm Matthew Handley. Today we are reading Book 7, Chapters 3 and 4, and Book 8, Chapter 1. In today's story, Father Vaillant continues his preaching in Arizona, and Bishop Latour stays with a Navajo friend. In the second half of the program, Dr. Marcus Peter and I continue our conversation about preaching and discuss forming a Catholic imagination. But first, Death Comes for the Archbishop.
Chapter 3, Spring in the Navajo Country.
Father Vaillant was away in Arizona all winter. When the first hint of spring was in the air, the bishop and Jacinto set out on a long ride across New Mexico, to the Painted Desert and the Hopi villages. After they left Oraibi, the bishop rode several days to the south to visit a Navajo friend who had lately lost his only son, and who had paid the bishop the compliment of sending word of the boy's death to him at Santa Fe. Father Latour had known Eusabio a long while, had met him soon after he came to his new diocese. The Navajo was in Santa Fe at the time, assisting the military officers to quiet an outbreak of the never-ending quarrel between his people and the Hopis. Ever since then, the bishop and the Indian chief had entertained an increasing regard for each other. Eusabio brought his son all the way to Santa Fe to have the bishop baptize him, that one beloved son who had died during this last winter. Though he was 10 years younger than Father Latour, Eusabio was one of the most influential men among the Navajo people, and one of the richest in sheep and horses. In Santa Fe and Albuquerque, he was respected for his intelligence and authority, and admired for his fine presence. He was extremely tall, even for a Navajo, with a face like a Roman general's of Republican times. He always dressed very elegantly in velvet and buckskin rich, with bead and quill embroidery, belted with silver, and wore a blanket of the finest wool and designs. His arms, under the loose sleeves of his shirt, were covered with silver bracelets, and on his breast hung a very old necklace of wampum and turquoise and coral, Mediterranean coral, that had been left in the Navajo country by Coronado's captains when they passed through it on their way to discover the Hopi villages and the Grand Canyon. Eusabio lived with his relatives and dependents in a group of hogans on the Colorado Chiquito. To the west and south and north his kinsmen herded his great flocks. Father Latour and Jacinto arrived in the cluster of booth-like cabins during a high sandstorm, which circled about them and their mules like snow in a blizzard and all but obliterated the landscape. The Navajo came out of his house and took possession of Angelica by her bridle bit. At first he did not open his lips, merely stood holding Father Latour's very fine white hand in his very fine dark one, and looked into his face with a message of sorrow and resignation in his deep-set, eagle eyes. A wave of feeling passed over his bronze features as he said slowly, "My friend has come." That was all, but it was everything. Welcome, confidence, appreciation. For his lodging, the bishop was given a solitary hogan, a little apart from the settlement. Eusabio quickly furnished it with his best skins and blankets, and told his guests that he must tarry a few days there and recover from his fatigue. His mules were tired, the Indian said. The padre himself looked weary, and the way to Santa Fe was long. The bishop thanked him and said he would stay 3 days, that he had need for reflection. His mind had been taken up with practical matters ever since he left home. This seemed a spot where a man might get his thoughts together. The river, a considerable stream at this time of year, wound among the mounds and dunes of loose sand, which whirled through the air all day in the boisterous spring winds. The sand banked up against the hogan the bishop occupied, and filtered through the chinks in the walls, which were made of saplings plastered with clay. Beside the river was a grove of tall, naked cottonwoods, trees of great antiquity and enormous size, so large that they seemed to belong to a bygone age. They grew far apart, and their strange twisted shapes must have come about from the ceaseless winds that bent them to the east and scoured them with sand, and from the fact that they lived with very little water. The river was nearly dry here for most of the year. The trees rose out of the ground at a slant, and 40 or 50 feet above the earth, all these white, dry trunks changed their direction, grew back over their baseline. Some split into great forks which arched down almost to the ground. Some did not fork at all, but the main trunk dipped downward in a strong curve, as if drawn by a bowstring, and some terminated in a thick coruscation of growth, like a crooked palm tree. They were all living trees, yet they seemed to be of old, dead, dry wood, and had very scant foliage. High up in the forks, or at the ends of the preposterous length of twisted bough, would burst a faint bouquet of delicate green leaves, out of all keeping with the great lengths of seasoned white trunk and branches. The grove looked like a winter wood of giant trees, with clusters of mistletoe growing among the bare boughs. Navajo hospitality is not intrusive. Eusabio made the bishop understand that he was glad to have him there, and let him alone. Father Latour lived for 3 days in an almost perpetual sandstorm, cut off from even this remote little Indian camp by moving walls and tapestries of sand. He either sat in his house and listened to the wind, or walked abroad under those aged wind-distorted trees, muffled in an Indian blanket, which he kept drawn up over his mouth and nose. Since his arrival he had undertaken to decide whether he would be justified in recalling Father Vaillant from Tucson. The vicar's occasional letters, brought by travelers, showed that he was highly content where he was, restoring the old mission church of St. Xavier del Bac, which he had declared to be the most beautiful church on the continent, though it had been neglected for more than 200 years. Since Father Vaillant went away, the bishop's burdens had grown heavier and heavier. The new priests from Auvergne were all good men, faithful and untiring in carrying out his wishes, but they were still strangers to the country, timid about making decisions, and referred every difficulty to their bishop. Father Latour needed his vicar, who had so much tact with the natives, so much sympathy with all their shortcomings. When they were together, he was always curbing Father Vaillant's hopeful rashness, but left alone, he greatly missed that very quality, and he missed Father Vaillant's companionship. Why not admit it? Although Jean-Marie Latour and Joseph Vaillant were born in neighboring parishes in the Puy-de-Dôme, as children they had not known each other. The Latours were an old family of scholars and professional men, while the Vaillants were people of a much humbler station in the provincial world. Besides, little Joseph had been away from home much of the time, up on the farm in the Volvic Mountains with his grandfather, where the air was especially pure and the country quite solitary for a child of nervous temperament. The two boys had not come together until they were seminarians at Montferrand in Clermont. When Jean-Marie was in his second year at the seminary, he was standing on the recreation ground one day at the opening of the term, looking with curiosity at the new students. In the group, he noticed one of peculiarly unpromising appearance, a boy of 19 who was undersized, very pale, homely in feature, with a wart on his chin and a tow-colored hair that made him look like a German. This boy seemed to feel his glance, and came up at once, as if he had been called. He was apparently quite unconscious of his homeliness, was not shy at all, but intensely interested in his new surroundings. He asked Jean Latour his name, where he came from, and his father's occupation. Then he said with great simplicity, "My father is a baker, the best in Riom. In fact, he's a remarkable baker." Young Latour was amused, but expressed polite appreciation of this confidence. The queer lad went on to tell him about his brother and his aunt, and his clever little sister Philomene. He asked how long Latour had been at the seminary. "Have you always intended to take orders?" "So have I, but I very nearly went into the army instead." The year previous, after the surrender of Algiers, there had been a military review at Clermont, a great display of uniforms and military bands, and stirring speeches about the glory of French arms. Young Joseph Vaillant had lost his head in the excitement, and had signed up for a volunteer without consulting his father. He gave Latour a vivid account of his patriotic emotions, of his father's displeasure, and his own subsequent remorse. His mother had wished him to become a priest. She died when he was 13, and ever since then he had meant to carry out her wish and to dedicate his life to the service of the Divine Mother. But that one day, among the bands and uniforms, he had forgotten everything but his desire to serve France. Suddenly, young Vaillant broke off, saying that he must write a letter before the hour was over, and tucking up his gown, he ran away at full speed. Latour stood looking after him, resolved that he would take this new boy under his protection. There was something about the baker's son that had given their meeting the color of an adventure. He meant to repeat it. In that first encounter, he chose the lively, ugly boy for his friend. It was instantaneous. Latour himself was much cooler and more critical in temper, hard to please, and often a little gray in mood. During their seminary years, he had easily surpassed his friend in scholarship, but he always realized that Joseph excelled him in the fervor of his faith. After they became missionaries, Joseph learned to speak English, and later Spanish, more readily than he. To be sure, he spoke both languages very incorrectly at first, but he had no vanity about grammar or refinement of phrase. To communicate with peons, he was quite willing to speak like a peon. Though the bishop had worked with Father Joseph for 25 years now, he could not reconcile the contradictions of his nature. He simply accepted them, and when Joseph had been away a long while, realized that he loved them all. His vicar was one of the most truly spiritual men he had ever known, though he was so passionately attached to many of the things of this world. Fond as he was of good eating and drinking, he not only rigidly observed all the fasts of the church, but he never complained about the hardness and scantiness of the fare on his long missionary journeys. Father Joseph's relish for good wine might have been a fault in another man, but always frail in body, he seemed to need some quick physical stimulant to support his sudden flights for a purpose and imagination. Time and again the bishop had seen a good dinner, a bottle of claret, transformed into spiritual energy under his very eyes. From a little feast that would make other men heavy and desirous of repose, Father Vaillant would rise up revived and work for 10 or 12 hours with that ardor and thoroughness which accomplished such lasting results. The bishop had often been embarrassed by his vicar's persistence in begging for the parish, for the cathedral fund, and the distant missions. Yet for himself, Father Joseph was scarcely acquisitive to the point of decency. He owed nothing to this world but his mule Contento. Though he had received rich vestments from his sister in Riom, his daily apparel was rough and shabby. The bishop had a large and valuable library, at least, and many comforts for his house. There were his beautiful skins and blankets, presents from Eusabio and his other Indian friends. The Mexican women, skilled in needlework and lace-making and hem-stitching, presented him with fine linen for his person, his bed, and his table. He had large silver plates, given him by the Olivares and others of his rich parishioners. But Father Joseph Vaillant was like the saints of the early church, literally without personal possessions. In his youth, Joseph wanted to lead a life of seclusion and solitary devotion, but the truth was he could not be happy for long without human intercourse. And he liked almost everyone. In Ohio, when they used to travel together in stagecoaches, Father Latour had noticed that every time a new passenger pushed his way into the already crowded stage, Joseph would look pleased and interested, as if it were an agreeable addition, whereas he himself felt annoyed, even if he concealed it. The ugly conditions of life in Ohio had never troubled Joseph. The hideous houses and churches, the ill-kept farms and gardens, the slovenly, sordid aspects of the towns and countryside, which continually depressed Father Latour, he seemed scarcely to perceive. One would have said he had no feeling for comeliness or grace. Yet music was a passion with him. In Sandusky it had been his delight to spend evening after evening with his German choirmaster, training the young people to sing Bach oratorios. Nothing one could say of Father Vaillant explained him. The man was much greater than the sum of his qualities. He added a glow to whatever kind of human society he was dropped into, a Navajo hogan, some abjectly poor little huddle of Mexican huts, or a company of Monsignorian cardinals at Rome. It was all the same. The last time the bishop was in Rome, he had heard an amusing story from Monsignor Mazzucci, who had been secretary to Gregory XVI at the time when Father Vaillant went from his Ohio mission for his first visit to the Holy City. Joseph had stayed in Rome for 3 months, living on about 40 cents a day and leaving nothing unseen. He several times asked Mazzucci to secure him a private audience with the Pope. The secretary liked the missionary from Ohio. There was something abrupt and lively and naive about him, a kind of freshness that he did not often find in priests who flocked to Rome. So he arranged an interview at which only the Holy Father and Father Vaillant and Mazzucci were present. The missionary came in, attended by a chamberlain who carried 2 great black valises full of objects to be blessed, instead of one, as was customary. After his reception, Father Joseph began to pour out such vivid account of his missions and his brother missionaries that both the Holy Father and the secretary forgot to take account of the time, and the audience lasted 3 times as long as interviews were supposed to last. Gregory XVI, that aristocratic and autocratic prelate who stood so consistently on the wrong side of European politics and was the enemy of free Italy, had done more than any of his predecessors to propagate the faith in remote parts of the world. And here was a missionary after his own heart. Father Vaillant asked for blessings for himself, his fellow priests, his missions, his bishop. He opened his big valises like peddler's packs, full of crosses, rosaries, prayer books, medals, breviaries, on which he begged more than the usual blessing. The astonished chamberlain had come and gone several times, and Mazzucci at last reminded the Holy Father that he had other engagements. Father Vaillant caught up his 2 valises himself, and the chamberlain, not being there at the moment, and thus laden, was bowing himself backward out of the presence, when the Pope rose from his chair and lifted his hand, not in benediction, but in salutation, and called out to the departing missionary as one man to another, "Coraggio, Americano!" Bishop Latour found his Navajo house favorable for reflection, for recalling the past and planning the future. He wrote long letters to his brother and to old friends in France. The hogan was isolated like a ship's cabin on the ocean, with murmuring of great winds about it. There was no opening except the door, always open, and the air without had the turbid yellow light of sandstorms. All day long the sand came in through the cracks in the walls and formed little ridges on the earth floor. It rattled like sleet upon the dead leaves of the tree-branch roof. This house was so frail a shelter that one seemed to be sitting in the heart of a world made of dusty earth and moving air.
Chapter 4. Eusabio.
On the 3rd day of his visit with Eusabio, the bishop wrote a somewhat formal letter of recall to his vicar, and then went for his daily walk in the desert. He stayed out until sunset, when the wind fell and the air cleared to a crystal sharpness. As he was returning, still a mile or more up the river, he heard the deep sound of a cottonwood drum, beaten softly. He surmised that the sound came from Eusabio's house, and that his friend was at home. Retracing his steps to the settlement, Father Latour found Eusabio seated beside his doorway, singing in the Navajo language and beating softly on one end of his long drum. Before him, 2 very little Indian boys, about 4 or 5 years old, were dancing to the music on the hard, beaten ground. 2 women, Eusabio's wife and sister, looked on from the deep twilight of the hut. The little boys did not notice the stranger's approach. They were entirely engrossed in their occupation, their faces serious, their chocolate-colored eyes half closed. The bishop stood watching the flowing, supple movements of their arms and shoulders, the sure rhythm of their tiny moccasined feet, no larger than cottonwood leaves, as without a word of instruction they followed the irregular and strangely accented music. Eusabio himself wore an expression of religious gravity. He sat with the drum between his knees, his broad shoulders bent forward. A crimson banda covered his forehead to hold his black hair. The silver on his dark wrist glittered as he stroked the drum head with a stick or merely tapped it with his fingers. When he was finished with the song he was singing, he rose and introduced the little boys, his nephews, by their Indian names, Eagle Feather and Medicine Mountain, after which he nodded to them in dismissal. They vanished into the house. Eusabio handed the drum to his wife and walked away with his guest. "Eusabio," said the bishop, "I want to send a letter to Father Vaillant at Tucson. I will send Jacinto with it, provided you can spare me one of your people to accompany me back to Santa Fe." "I myself will ride with you to the villa," said Eusabio. The Navajos still call the capital by its old name. Accordingly, on the following morning, Jacinto was dispatched southward, and Father Latour and Eusabio, with their pack mule, rode to the east. The ride back to Santa Fe was something under 400 miles. The weather alternated between blinding sandstorms and brilliant sunlight. The sky was as full of motion and change as the desert beneath it was monotonous and still, and there was so much sky, more than at sea, more than anywhere else in the world. The plain was there, under one's feet, but what one saw when he looked out about was the brilliant blue world of stinging air and moving cloud. Even the mountains were mere ant-hills under it. Elsewhere the sky is the roof of the world, but here the earth was the floor of the sky. The landscape one longed for when one was far away, the thing all about one, the world actually lived in, was the sky, the sky. Traveling with Eusabio was like traveling with the landscape made human. He accepted chance and weather as the country did, with a sort of grave enjoyment. He talked little, ate little, slept anywhere, preserved a countenance open and warm, and like Jacinto, he had unfailing good manners. The bishop was rather surprised that he stopped so often by the way to gather flowers. One morning he came back with the mules, holding a bunch of crimson flowers, long tube-shaped bells that hung lightly from one side of a naked stem and a tremble in the wind. "The Indians call rainbow flower," he said, holding them up and making the red tubes quiver. "It is early for these." When they left the rock or tree or sand dune that had sheltered them for the night, the Navajo was careful to obliterate every trace of their temporary occupation. He buried the embers of the fire in the remnants of food, unpiled any stones he had piled together, filled up the holes he had scooped into the sand. Since this was exactly Jacinto's procedure, Father Latour judged that, just as it was the white man's way to assert himself in any landscape, to change it, make it over, at least to leave some mark or memorial of his sojourn, it was the Indian's way to pass through a country without disturbing anything, to pass and leave no trace, like fish through the water or birds through the air. It was the Indian manner to vanish into the landscape, not to stand out against it. The Hopi villages were set upon rock mesas, were made to look like the rock on which they sat, were imperceptible at a distance. The Navajo hogans among the sand and willows were made of sand and willows. None of the pueblos would at that time admit glass windows into their dwellings. The reflection of the sun on the glazing was to them ugly and unnatural, even dangerous. Moreover, these Indians disliked novelty and change. They came and went by the old paths worn into the rock by the feet of their fathers, used the old natural stairway of stone to climb to their mesa towers, carried water from the old springs, even after white men had dug wells. In the working of silver or drilling of turquoise, the Indians had exhaustless patience. Upon their blankets and belts and ceremonial robes, they lavished their skill and pains, but their conception of decoration did not extend to the landscape. They seemed to have none of the European desire to master nature, to arrange and recreate. They spent their ingenuity in the other direction, in accommodating themselves to the scene which they found themselves. This was not so much from indolence, the bishop thought, as from an inherited caution and respect. It was as if the great country were asleep, and they wished to carry on their lives without awakening it, or as if the spirits of earth and air and water were things not to antagonize and arouse. When they hunted, it was with the same discretion. An Indian hunt was never a slaughter. They ravaged neither the forests nor the rivers, and if they irrigated, they took as little water as that would serve their needs. The land and all it bore they treated with consideration, not attempting to improve it. They never desecrated it. As Father Latour and Eusabio approached Albuquerque, they occasionally fell in with company, Indian goings to and fro on the long, winding trails across the plain or up into the Sandia Mountains. They had all of them the same quiet way of moving, whether their pace was swift or slow, and the same unobtrusive demeanor. An Indian wrapped in his bright blanket, seated upon his mule or walking beside it, moving through the pale, new-budding sagebrush, winding among the sand waves as if it were his business to pass unseen and unheard through a country awakening with spring. North of Laguna, 2 Zuni runners sped by them, going somewhere east on Indian business. They saluted Eusabio by gestures with the open palm, but did not stop. They coursed over the sand with the fleetness of young antelope, their bodies disappearing and reappearing among the sand dunes, like shadows that eagle cast in their strong, unhurried flight.
Book 8, Gold Under Pike's Peak. Chapter 1, Cathedral.
Father Vaillant had been in Santa Fe nearly 3 weeks, and as yet nothing had been revealed to him that warranted his bishop in calling him back from Tucson. One morning, Fructosa came into the garden to tell him that lunch would be earlier than usual, as the bishop was going to ride somewhere that afternoon. Half an hour later, he joined his superior in the dining room. The bishop seldom lunched alone. That was the hour when he could most conveniently entertain a priest from one of the distant parishes, an army officer, an American trader, a visitor from Old Mexico or California. He had no parlor. His dining room served that purpose. It was long and cool, with windows only at the west end opening into the garden, the green jalousies that let in tempered light. Sunbeams played on the white, rounded walls and twinkled on the glass and the silver of the sideboard. When Madame Olivares left Santa Fe to return to New Orleans and sold her effects at an auction, Father Latour bought her sideboard and the dining table around which friends had so often gathered. Doña Isabella gave him her silver coffee service and candelabra for remembrance. They were the only ornaments to serve the shadowy room. The bishop was already at his place when Father Joseph entered. "Fructosa has told you why we are lunching early. We will take a ride this afternoon. I have something to show you." "Very good. Perhaps you have noticed that I am a little restless. I don't know when I have been 2 weeks out of the saddle before. When I got to visit Contento in his stall, he looked at me reprovingly. He will grow too fat." The bishop smiled, with a shade of sarcasm on his upper lip. He knew his Joseph. "Ah, well," he said carelessly, "a little rest will not hurt him after coming 600 miles from Tucson. You can take him out this afternoon, and I will ride Angelica." The 2 priests left Santa Fe a little after midday, riding west. The bishop did not disclose his objective, and the vicar asked no questions. Soon they left the wagon road and led a trail running straight south, through an empty greasewood country sloping gradually in the direction of the naked blue Sandia Mountains. At about 4 o'clock they came out upon a ridge high over the Rio Grande Valley. The trail dropped down a long decline, and at this point, and wound about the foot of the Sandias into Albuquerque, some 60 miles away. The ridge was covered with cone-shaped rocky hills, thinly clad with piñons, and the rock was a curious shade of green, something between sea green and olive. The thin, pebbly earth, which was merely the rock pulverized by weather, had the same green tint. Father Latour rode to an isolated hill that beetled over the western edge of the ridge, just where the trail descended. This hill stood up high and quite alone, boldly facing the declining sun and the blue Sandias. As they drew close to it, Father Vaillant noticed that on the western face the earth had been scooped away, exposing a rugged wall of rock, not green like the surrounding hills, but yellow, a strong golden ochre, very much like the gold of the sunlight that was now beating upon it. Picks and crowbars laid about, and fragments of stone, freshly broken off. "It is curious, is it not, to find one yellow hill among all these green ones?" remarked the bishop, stooping to pick up a piece of the stone. "I've ridden over these hills in every direction, but this is the only one of its kind." He stood regarding the chip of yellow rock that lay in his palm. As he had a very special way of handling objects that were sacred, he extended that manner to things which he considered beautiful. After a moment of silence, he looked up at the rugged wall, gleaming gold above them. "That hill, Blanche, is my cathedral." Father Joseph looked at his bishop, then at the cliff, blinking. "Vraiment? Is the stone hard enough? A good color, certainly, something like the colonnade of St. Peter's." The bishop smoothed the piece of his rock with his thumb. "It is more like something nearer home. I mean nearer Clermont. When I look at this rock, I can almost feel the Rhone behind me. Ah, you mean the old palace of the popes at Avignon? Yes, you are right. It is very like. At this hour, it is like this. The bishop sat down on a boulder, still looking up at the cliff. It is the stone I have always wanted, and I found it quite by chance. I was coming back from Isleta. I had been to see old Padre Jesus when he was dying. I had never come by this trail, but when I reached Santo Domingo, I found the road so washed by a heavy rain that I turned out and decided to try this way home. I rode up here from the west of the late afternoon, and this hill confronted me as it confronts us now, and I knew instantly that it was my cathedral. Oh, such things are never accident, Jean, but it will be a long while before you can think of building. Not so very long, I hope. I should like to think it completed before I die, if God so wills. I wish to leave nothing to chance or to the mercy of American builders. I'd rather keep the old adobe church we have now than help build one of those horrible structures they're putting up in the Ohio cities. I want a plain church, but I want a good one. I shall certainly never lift my hand to build a clumsy affair of red brick like an English coach house. Our own midi Romanesque is the right style for this country. Father Vaillant sniffed and wiped his glasses. If you once begin thinking about architects and styles, Jean, and if you don't get American builders, who will you get, pray? I have an old friend in Toulouse who's a very fine architect. I talked this matter over with him when I was last at home. He cannot come himself. He's afraid of the long sea voyage and not used to horseback travel, but he has a young son still at his studies who's eager to undertake the work. Indeed, his father writes to me that it has become the young man's dearest ambition to build the first Romanesque church in the New World. He will have studied the right models. He thinks our old churches of the Midi are the most beautiful in France. When we are ready, he will come and bring with him a good couple of French stonecutters. They will certainly be no more expensive than the workmen from St. Louis. Now that I have found exactly the stone I want, my cathedral seems to me already begun. This hill is only about 15 miles from Santa Fe. There is an upgrade, but it's gradual. Hauling the stone will be easier than I could have hoped for. You plan far ahead, Father Vaillant looked at his friend wonderingly. Well, that is what a bishop should be able to do. As for me, I only see what is under my nose. But I had no idea you were going in for a fine building, when everything about us is so poor. We ourselves are so poor. But the cathedral is not for us, Father Joseph. We build for the future. Better not lay a stone unless we can do that. It would be a shame to any man coming from a seminary that is one of the architectural treasures of France to make another ugly church on this continent when there's already so many. You are probably right. I had never thought of it before. It never occurred to me that we could have anything but an Ohio church here. Your ancestors helped to build Clermont Cathedral, I remember. 2 building bishops de Latour back in the 13th century. Time brings things to pass, certainly. I had no idea you were taking this so much to heart. Father Latour laughed. Is a cathedral something to be taken lightly after all? Oh, no, certainly not, Father Vaillant moved his shoulders uneasily. He did not himself know why he hung back in this. The base of the hill before which they stood, already in shadow, subdued to the tone of the rich yellow clay, but the top was still melted gold, a color that throbbed in the last rays of the sun. The bishop turned away at last with a sigh of deep content. Yes, he said slowly, that rock will do very well. And now we must be starting home. Every time I come here, I like this stone better. I could hardly have hoped that God would gratify my personal taste, my vanity, if you will, in this way. I tell you, Blanchet, I would rather have found that hill of yellow rock than have come into a fortune to spend in charity. The cathedral is near my heart for many reasons. I hope you do not think me very worldly. As they rode home through the sagebrush silvered by moonlight, Father Vaillant was still wondering why he had been called home from saving souls in Arizona, and wondering why a poor missionary bishop should care so much about a building. He himself was eager to have the cathedral begun, but whether it was Midi Romanesque or Ohio German in style seemed to him of little consequence. Coming up.
So like you, the only thing I'm doing every day is showing up telling people Jesus Christ is Lord. His lordship permeates every aspect of the culture, and this is devoid of no one.
Now this.
Support for this program comes from NordVPN, a provider of virtual private network services. NordVPN offers tools designed to encrypt internet traffic and route connections through remote servers, helping to enhance online privacy and reduce digital tracking. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/NordVPN. And by Expedia, an online travel service offering booking options for flights, hotels, rental cars, and vacation packages. Expedia provides tools to compare and book accommodations, transportation, and activities with a wide selection of options available. More information is available at purplecatholic.com/Expedia.
Welcome back to the program. I'm Matthew Handley. Dr. Marcus Peter and I were discussing challenges to preaching last week, and we're going to pick up that conversation where we left off.
Really, all I'm doing is I'm always studying, I'm always reading like you, and I realize where I came from, and so my language, at least I strive to anyways, my language tends to be, I want to have this discussion to as deep a level as I can, because people need to know this. And they also we need to be able to converse about these things and not expect that just because we've gone to the university, therefore we can. No, every American is privy to the knowledge of our Constitution, our founding ideals, the way our economics are run right now, the meaning of tariffs and what that does in terms of upward or downward economic pressure and fiscal pressure on the price of things, or foreign relations, what the Monroe Doctrine does in differing from what Washington's foreign policy was. Every American should be conversant in all these things. It's not because we are ivory tower learned, astute individuals. It's because we're Catholic Americans, and Catholic first. And so the application of these biblical truths that are shallow enough that a child can wade in those waters, yet deep enough that the most learned adult can keep diving and never plumb the depths, that's the call for all of us. So like you, the only thing I'm doing every day is showing up, telling people Jesus Christ is Lord. His lordship permeates every aspect of the culture, and this is devoid of no one. Just like this book, Death Comes for the Archbishop, because very frankly, the story of the Archbishop is exactly what you and I are going through. We are learning to repackage, if you will, the gospel in a sacramental way to a desacramentalized culture.
This is more of a little bit of a practical question, but do you suppose it's easier on the radio or in other new media versus perhaps what you used to do going around giving lectures?
You know, I have a special love for radio. I've developed a special love for radio, but my first call has always been to be the traveling preacher, the grassroots preacher. What I do believe the merit of radio is like right now, Matthew, you and I are having this conversation. When people listen in, you and I are not talking to billions of people, even though billions will listen to this. We're talking to that one person listening in. We're talking to each other about these truths that have completely transformed our lives. There's an intimacy to this medium that, especially broadcast radio, that few other mediums have. And that, I believe, is its fundamental merit. Broadcast television has that to some degree, but it's different. You're not listening in, you're watching a show. And so the conversation takes on a different tone. It has a different effect on the person. But all said and done, I'm not apocalyptic by any sense, but if the grid were to go down, you and I would still be standing on the street corner telling people about the very truths we're telling people about on the microphone. And that's because we are compelled by this. And so it will never do away with that need for personal evangelization, even if it is to hundreds of thousands. You know, like let's say any one of us could stand on stage and speak to hundreds of thousands. We will still never do away with the need for speaking to small groups, to speaking to a few people that need to hear the gospel.
Yeah, and sometimes the small group is better than, you know, Jesus could attract a crowd on the mountain, obviously, when he provided the Sermon on the Mount. But sometimes I think starting with small groups is, in some senses, a little more effective, because when you have, especially if it's a group of friends, you all know each other. Your personal witness is now radiating out and affecting them. which then it may spur them to think a little deeper about things, which may spur other people, and you kind of have this chain reaction that you and I've discussed before on the radio. Do you think finding a small group and in sense preaching to that group either by actions or by words is the right method to start? Or is it, and we've got friends at St. Paul Street Evangelization there in Detroit that do some good work, meeting people and not offering to pray with them. There's all kinds of different ways to reach out to people. Yeah. What do you find most effective?
For me, I think it starts with discernment. Every one of us is called to evangelize. It's a baptismal mandate, but the expression is going to vary. And when I first gave my life to Christ, the Pentecostals whom I was with discerned that my call was to be an itinerant preacher. Now, I'm not going to put too much stock in any one label, but that's the office of, quote-unquote, the prophet that Paul talks about in Romans. Specifically, different people are called to evangelize differently. So some are teachers, some are preachers, and so the itinerant preacher means I sincerely believe my calling is to travel to groups, to revitalize them with the gospel, and then to move on from there, to keep bringing the gospel wherever I am called to. But there are some people who are gifted with a calling that's even deeper than that. And I believe you're one of those people, Matthew, because I can sense that this question comes from a place of recognizing that urgency, which is to be a part of that group, to journey with that group, to keep evangelizing that group, that the seeds that were planted, so Paul plants, Apollos waters the plant, but it's God who makes the plant grow. Mm-hmm. And the one who stays and tends to the plant tends to do more work than the one who did the planting. And the call here for all of us is to discern, where's my place in this work of evangelization? The mother at home has been gifted with the audience of her children to evangelize. The father in his workplace has been gifted with his colleagues as audience to evangelize. Those are starting points. Mm-hmm. But it expands from there, right? So some of us might get involved in OCIA groups, and therefore we are now part of a long-term system of evangelization. Some of us travel and preach to different groups, and we are part of long-term evangelization as well. I think discernment is necessary. Now, I enjoy writing. I enjoy preaching, giving talks. I greatly enjoy the work I get to do daily on the radio. But I have to sincerely say, I think the thing I enjoy the most is praying for and helping my bride and children become saints, and watching and watching myself do that in the process. And so those might be the different facets. And I know that's not the answer you were looking for, but I hope it's helpful to our listeners.
No, it's a great answer, and it's something that I in my own personal life have thought about this as I think about who is God calling me to be, and secondarily, what is God calling me to do? Mm-hmm. Well, God has called me to be a husband and father, so that takes precedence over necessarily what I do, as long as what I'm doing is not contradicting faith or morals in any particular way. I'm not out scamming old ladies in the park somewhere. So I think that's a great answer. That first witness is to your wife and to your children, and God willing, someday their children, and so on and so forth. I was blessed to go to a classical Catholic high school, and they had a very deep focus on literature, and the way they broke it up over the grades was you had ancient, and then the next year you had medieval, and then the next year you had European, and then American. And so you really cover the gamut of starting with Homer's. We would read the Odyssey first and then the Iliad. I don't remember what the reasoning was for that. You would read Homer, and then in your sophomore year, you'd be reading Dante and the Aeneid, and you'd move on to the European works as well. Jane Austen, you had mentioned, was one of them, and obviously you got the American literature in your senior year. And so I know that I am very fortunate that I've had that opportunity as a young person to be steeped in that, if you will. I don't know that I necessarily appreciated it enough at the time, as any 15, 16-year-old is probably looking at the Inferno and going, okay, but I have great appreciation for it now. Especially with the way that we can learn about the world through these works, and learn about other people's experiences. a lot of these, even if they're not written by a Catholic, they can really help form in a Catholic imagination. And I really think right now there hasn't been a ton said, or at least not that I'm aware of as much. We talk about forming a Catholic conscience and forming living a Catholic life in accordance with that. At the same time, our society and our culture is so corrupted around its imagination. We have conflicts. We have, we spew vile language in our television shows. There's pornography everywhere. There really ought to be something that can help form our Catholic imagination. And I think literature does that, good literature. I think there's better television and movies being made now, but I think literature's a real good place to start with that.
I think the most profound place to start with it is, and this is going to sound silly, but I think let's begin with the story of salvation history. Seeing it as so salvation history is objectively real. These were stories of true people. If we can teach our children that God worked through this story, we start seeing that every story can be baptized if there's virtue in it. Now, there are some stories out there that are just plain garbage, right? There's this horrible series, The Shades of Grey. You remember?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the name of the series again?
It's 50 Shades.
50 Shades of Grey. That's right. It's some random number. I always forget. And I don't know anything about it other than I heard Kristalina Everett share briefly what it was, and I thought, and this is what qualifies for famous literature today.
Yeah.
That's and that's the other thing, right? That the kind of art that comes out of a culture tends to be a finger on the pulse of the culture at the time. And so going back to these great works, like you mentioned, is crucial for parents first, before I even argue that children ought to. And I think we've lost sight of that. We become so utilitarian. I think the best place for us to begin would be salvation history. And then from there, like you mentioned, pick up the Greek greats. Pick up the Latin greats. In fact, learn about why the Aeneid was a kind of response to the Odyssey. What happened?
Yeah.
Learn about what Homer had to say about the Carthaginians and why, and this whole thing with Dido and what happened. There's a lot that can be done there. But I also want to take it a step further. Like you mentioned, Matthew, I think part of the problem with living in the U.S. is we have peace on all borders. There's nothing trying our faith. We're free. There's nothing trying our lives. We're free. And because of that, the sheer gift of the expansive potential of education we have here is taken for granted. When I was in the Philippines, we called them street children because that's the name of the ministry. And these were children, quite frankly, abandoned by their parents on the streets. And, we'd take them in. They would kill for a K through 12 education here in the U.S. that our high school seniors can't wait to get out of, so much so that they celebrate by vandalizing their schools, burning their school insignia. Senioritis is a uniquely American phenomenon. And it breaks my heart. It truly does. Because you live in third world nations like India, the Philippines, and you realize very, very quickly that what we take for granted because of affluence is a tremendous gift for the starving. And if we can learn to appreciate that better, in fact, if we can communicate that to our children better, and I know it's kind of a trope, right? Finish your food, there's starving people in China.
Right.
That's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm really trying to make is, children, you need to understand that this gift you have came at the cost of the blood of those who've gone before you. And that this tree of liberty, as Jefferson called it, is that which we find shade under, and we need to refresh it with the blood of patriots and tyrants, sure, but also with our fidelity, with our diligence. And so don't take this for granted. You're not studying for the sake of studying. You're studying so that you can become good people. And it begins with parents, our generation of parents, learning to think rightly, to speak rightly, so that we can teach our children rightly. I'm firmly convinced that this is how we're going to reclaim the culture and, like you said, re-begin again with an appreciation of literature.
And our Catholic schools have a real opportunity to step up and show the example for that, and both at the grade level and then higher education as well. You see some of the great expansion of I know Ave Maria's got Ave Maria University is a sponsor, and I know that there are others out there as well that sponsor other Catholic radio stations and networks. But you're right. I think the good books is the place to start. Let me turn it over to you and see if there's any final thoughts that you have, either about the story that we're reading here in Death Comes for the Archbishop, or about literature in general that you think, for someone who's thinking about, God is calling me to do more in my life to witness to the gospel, either by actually going out and preaching proper, or by just the witness of their living. Is there anything that you would want to share with him or her about something they ought to be reading or be thinking about as they're reading literature?
The first book that comes to mind is, it's published by University of Mary. The author is unknown. I have suspicions of who it might be. One of Al's favorite books was From Christendom to Apostolic Mission. And the book is essentially telling us that we have lost the privileges that Christendom allotted us. And now there is an urgency for us to rise up. And so my answer to someone asking that question is, yes, do it. You have social media, you already have a platform. How many friends do you have? 2,000, 3,000? Okay, great. You've got an audience of 2,000 to 3,000 people. Start telling them about Jesus. Do it poorly, I don't care. Just use your cell phone, start there, get better as you go, but start small, be consistent, but please do it. Fill the digital space with the gospel, lest it be completely consumed by the anti-gospel. And to that end, study. Studying is not a privilege for the learned, it is an obligation for the baptized. Every one of us. Pick up anything we can and just start reading, learning. So listening to your podcast would be a great way to do that. I want to recommend Ave Maria in the afternoon, everything we do at Ave Maria Radio, but also just pick up the great books. If you Google the word great books, it's going to give you a list of everything you have to read. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking of Don Quixote, the Divine Comedy being another, the Bible, obviously, and the list just goes on. Please pick up these books, read, form the linguistic capacity of being able to dialogue this heritage that comes as a result of Western civilization. You've been born into it. Don't take it for granted. And then use this to reshape the world that's already starving for that great heritage that Christendom once gave it. And that's my exhortation.
Well, thank you very much, Marcus, for joining me on the program. I appreciate it.
Matthew, a real joy as always. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course. Next week on Death Comes for the Archbishop, Father Vaillant is sent away on a new missionary journey, this time to Colorado. I'm Matthew Handley. Lord willing, I'll talk to you then.
Special thanks to our broadcast partners. The Purple Catholic Literature Collection presents Death Comes for the Archbishop, narrated and presented by Matthew Handley. Copyright 2025 M.H. Media Ventures, LLC. All rights reserved. For more, visit purplecatholic.com.